The mahogany-paneled boardroom fell silent as Trump's voice echoed through the gilded halls of Mar-a-Lago. Golden chandeliers cast shadows across the faces of assembled business leaders, their Harvard and Yale pins glinting under the artificial light. Outside, palm trees swayed in the Florida breeze, but inside the air grew thick with tension. "These Harvard grads think they know everything," Trump declared, his voice dripping with disdain. The smell of expensive cologne mixed with the aroma of Cuban cigars as executives shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. Camera phones discreetly captured the moment, knowing this would become another viral soundbite. The mockery had begun, but none could predict the response it would trigger. Across the Atlantic, in a modest office in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré sat reviewing economic reports by candlelight. The power had been out for hours, a common occurrence that reminded him daily of his nation's struggles. His weathered hands traced over development plans, while the sounds of evening prayers drifted through his open window. A young aide burst through the door, smartphone in hand, showing him the viral clip of Trump's comments. The president's eyes narrowed as he watched the billionaire dismiss academic achievement with casual cruelty. "Mr. President, the international media is asking for your response," the aide whispered nervously. Traoré leaned back, a knowing smile spreading across his face. The irony wasn't lost on the Burkina leader who had risen from absolute poverty to transform a nation. His office walls, adorned with maps of Africa and photos of rural schools, told a different story of success. The worn wooden desk where he worked had once belonged to Thomas Sankara, another leader who understood that true intelligence couldn't be measured by test scores alone. Traoré remembered his own academic struggles, the nights spent studying by oil lamp, the rejections from universities. Yet here he was, leading a country through one of its most transformative periods in history. The contrast between Trump's golden towers and his humble surroundings sparked an idea that would shock the world. Sometimes the most powerful response comes from unexpected vulnerability. The decision formed in his mind like morning mist clearing from the savannah. While Trump mocked Harvard graduates from his position of inherited privilege, Traoré would do something unprecedented. He would reveal his own academic shortcomings not as shame, but as testament to a different kind of intelligence, the kind forged in struggle, tempered by genuine service and proven through authentic leadership. His fingers reached for the phone to call his communications director, knowing this moment would define not just his presidency, but his legacy. The world was about to witness what real leadership looked like when stripped of pretense and ego. The response would be more devastating than any political attack could ever be. The Presidential Communications Office in Ouagadougou had never experienced anything like it before. Phones rang incessantly as international journalists scrambled to understand what Ibrahim Traoré was planning. His press secretary, Aminata Kabore, stared at the handwritten note the president had given her just hours earlier. "Release my 1965 SAT scores." It read in his careful script, followed by detailed instructions about transparency and authenticity. The humid afternoon air carried the sound of motorbikes and vendors from the street below as she prepared for what would become the most unusual press conference in African political history. Her hands trembled slightly as she drafted the announcement that would send shockwaves around the globe. This wasn't just politics anymore. This was personal revelation on an unprecedented scale. In Washington, D.C., senior State Department officials gathered in an emergency briefing room, confusion etched on their faces. The morning briefing had been routine until news broke of Traoré's planned disclosure, sending diplomatic circles into chaos. "He's releasing what?" asked the deputy secretary, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses in disbelief. The room's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as analysts frantically pulled files on the Burkina leader's background. Coffee cups grew cold as they tried to understand the strategic implications of such radical transparency. Nobody had ever seen a sitting president voluntarily expose their academic failures to counter political rhetoric. The move defied every rule in the diplomatic playbook, yet somehow felt profoundly powerful. Social media erupted as news of the impending revelation spread across platforms like wildfire. Traoré's scores began trending globally within hours, with millions of users debating the implications of such unprecedented openness. African university students gathered around phones in dormitories from Lagos to Cairo, sensing something historic was unfolding. The hashtag carried messages of support, mixed with curiosity as people wondered what scores could be so significant. European political commentators struggled to contextualize this radical departure from traditional political messaging. In newsrooms from CNN to BBC, editors scrambled to assign their best reporters to cover what appeared to be either political suicide or genius. The world held its breath, waiting for a revelation that would redefine political vulnerability. By evening, Burkina Faso's modest presidential palace had transformed into the center of global attention. Satellite trucks lined the dusty streets as international media crews set up equipment under acacia trees. Local children peered through compound walls, amazed by the sudden invasion of foreign journalists speaking dozens of languages. Traoré walked through his residence's simple corridors, past family photos and traditional artifacts, knowing tomorrow would change everything. His wife, Jamila, found him in their bedroom, carefully folding the yellow document that would soon become front-page news worldwide. "Are you certain about this?" she asked softly, her hand resting on his shoulder. He nodded, understanding that sometimes the most courageous act is admitting your failures before the entire world. The yellowed paper emerged from a manila folder that had traveled across continents and through decades of uncertainty. Ibrahim Traoré's fingers traced the faded Educational Testing Service letterhead, dated October 15, 1965, as morning light filtered through his office windows. The document bore the official seal and signature of a long-dead administrator, authenticating scores that most politicians would have buried forever. His verbal score, 420. His mathematics score, 380. Combined total 800 out of a possible 1,600, barely clearing the threshold for college consideration. The paper crackled softly as he set it on his desk, knowing these numbers would soon be scrutinized by millions. This simple document represented more than test scores. It was evidence of a journey from failure to extraordinary leadership. In Princeton, New Jersey, the Educational Testing Service Archives Department received an unprecedented request for verification. Dr. Margaret Chen, the chief archivist, had spent 30 years managing historical records, but had never been asked to authenticate a sitting president's scores for public release. The climate-controlled storage facility hummed quietly as she located the corresponding records from 1965. Cross-referencing Traoré's student identification number with carbon copies stored in fireproof cabinets. Her white gloves carefully handled the original documents, comparing signatures and official stamps under magnifying equipment. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across rows of filing cabinets containing millions of test records. Within hours, she confirmed what the world was about to learn. The scores were authentic, unaltered, and remarkably low by traditional standards. The story behind these numbers began to unfold as journalists dug deeper into Traoré's educational background. In 1965, he was an 18-year-old from a village without electricity, taking a test designed by and for American students. The nearest testing center was a 6-hour bus ride through dusty roads in a country still struggling with the aftermath of colonial rule. He had studied English as a third language, learned mathematics without calculators or proper textbooks, and faced questions about American culture he had never encountered. The SAT assumed knowledge of suburban American life, references to shopping malls, baseball, and cultural contexts, completely foreign to a young African. His translator later revealed that Ibrahim had once asked what a homecoming dance meant, having never seen a high school gymnasium. These scores weren't failures. They were testimonies to an impossible dream pursued against overwhelming odds. As news outlets prepared their coverage, fact-checkers worked frantically to verify every detail surrounding the 1965 examination. The testing center in Dasagal had long since been demolished, but former staff members confirmed the grueling conditions faced by African students. Wooden desks, dim lighting, and oppressive heat created an environment worlds apart from American testing facilities. Phone calls to retired educators painted the picture of young Ibrahim, determined, despite obvious disadvantages, spending his family's savings on application fees and travel costs. Surviving records from the exam showed his test booklet marked with careful erasures and thoughtful reconsiderations, proof that he had taken the test seriously despite insurmountable challenges. Tomorrow these numbers would tell the world that sometimes the greatest leaders emerge not from perfect scores but from perfect determination. The village of Gorsi existed in a world where electricity was a distant dream and education a fragile luxury. Young Ibrahim Traoré walked barefoot along red dirt paths at dawn, carrying worn textbooks salvaged from a missionary school's donation pile. Acacia trees provided the only shade where children gathered to recite lessons, their voices blending with the grinding of millet and the bleating of goats. His mother, Fatima, watched from their mud brick compound, knowing her son's hunger for knowledge often outweighed their hunger for food. The nearest secondary school lay 40 kilometers away, reachable only by overcrowded bush taxis that cost more than the family's weekly income. Colonial French remained the language of instruction, while Ibrahim's thoughts flowed naturally in Mooré, creating yet another barrier. Each morning began with the impossible dream of reaching America for a university education. The one-room schoolhouse where he studied lacked even the basics. Chalk was scarce. Pencils were shared among dozens. Textbooks were little more than photocopied pages bound with string. His teacher, Monsieur Ouedraogo, had never traveled beyond Burkina Faso's borders, yet described continents and countries the boy could only imagine. During the dry season, dust storms halted classes for days, sending students home to tend farms or cattle. At night, Ibrahim studied by candlelight, copying formulas onto scraps of paper when notebooks ran out. The idea of standardized testing was alien in a place where survival mattered more than multiple-choice answers. Yet there was something in his eyes that suggested he would transcend these limits. Family gatherings around the fire revealed how heavily his ambitions weighed on the household. His grandfather, a traditional healer, spoke of dreams in which spirits told him the boy would travel far from home. But how? His aunts whispered, knowing their entire savings couldn't buy even a single plane ticket to Europe, much less America. The village chief, moved by Ibrahim's determination, organized small fundraising efforts. Neighbors who barely had enough for themselves donated coins. Merchants gave what little they could. Some villagers sold precious livestock, believing his education would bring honor to them all. By 1964, Ibrahim had exhausted every educational opportunity within 200 kilometers of his birthplace. His French had improved through countless hours of practice with Catholic missionaries, but English remained elusive, picked up only from smuggled magazines and scratchy radio broadcasts. The SAT preparation guides available to American students were unimaginable luxuries in rural Burkina Faso, leaving him to guess at the test structure. He memorized vocabulary words without fully grasping their cultural context, piecing together a vision of America from fragments. His mathematics training gave him the fundamentals, but he lacked the advanced concepts drilled into students in well-equipped schools. Despite overwhelming disadvantages, Ibrahim refused to abandon his dream of studying abroad. The 1965 SAT would be his first real test against the developed world's educational standards. The acceptance letter from Prairie View A&M University arrived on a sweltering afternoon in March 1966, 6 months after his disappointing scores. His hands trembled as he read the words that would change his destiny forever. Despite your test scores, we recognize potential in your application essay and life experiences. The historically black university in Texas had long embraced international students whose promise extended beyond standardized measurements. That evening, village elders gathered in the chief's compound, passing the letter around as if it were gold. Children pressed against the mud walls to glimpse the historic document that marked their village's first son going to America. Drums echoed across the savannah. Women sang songs of triumph, and the celebration lasted until dawn. For the first time, Ibrahim's low scores had not led to rejection, but to unprecedented opportunity. The fundraising effort to send him abroad soon spread beyond his village, spanning multiple provinces. Market vendors donated their daily profits. Farmers sold portions of their harvest, and even children contributed coins saved from small jobs. The local imam led special prayers and Friday collections, describing Ibrahim's education as a gift for the entire Muslim community. Even the French colonial administrators, initially skeptical, offered bureaucratic assistance when they recognized the young man's extraordinary determination. His passport photos were taken at the only studio within 300 kilometers, capturing both hope and apprehension in his eyes. For the visa interview at the American embassy in Ouagadougou, he traveled an entire day in borrowed clothes, his appearance polished with care and pride. By December 1966, Ibrahim held the documents required for what once seemed an impossible dream. The flight from Ouagadougou to Houston represented more than geography. It was a leap across centuries. Ibrahim had never seen an airplane up close, much less imagined sitting inside one for 12 hours. His single suitcase carried everything he owned: 2 changes of clothes, his grandfather's prayer beads, and notebooks filled with painstaking English translations. Other passengers, diplomats and businessmen, moved with the easy confidence of seasoned travelers, a stark contrast to his rural innocence. During a layover in Paris, he spent precious dollars to call home from a payphone, reassuring his family he was alive. The Air France attendants, noticing his unease, explained safety procedures to him kindly in French. When the plane descended over Texas, he pressed his face against the window, stunned by highways glowing with endless streams of light, electric grids stretching farther than his eyes could follow. Prairie View, A&M's campus in January 1967 shattered every assumption he held about American education. The library contained more books than his entire province. Students checked out volumes casually that represented months of a teacher's salary back home. His dormitory had electric heating, running water, and a telephone, luxuries beyond imagination. Other students complained about cafeteria food, while Ibrahim marveled at 3 guaranteed meals a day. The first time in his life he could count on regular nourishment. Academic advisors, troubled by the gap between his SAT scores and university requirements, watched him closely. Yet professors quickly discovered that his determination and discipline compensated for everything numbers could not measure. The young man who had barely passed America's entrance exam was about to prove that true intelligence could never be reduced to multiple-choice questions. Prairie View. A&M's rigorous academic environment initially overwhelmed the young man from Gorsi, but Ibrahim refused to surrender the sacrifices his family and village had made. He spent 18-hour days in the library, painstakingly translating dense economic theories from English into French and then into Moray, just to grasp basic concepts. His roommate, Marcus Johnson from Detroit, became an unlikely mentor, patiently explaining American cultural references that filled textbooks and lectures. At first, study groups excluded him because of his language struggles. But his persistence and unique perspectives gradually earned their respect. Professor Williams, who taught developmental economics, quickly noticed something remarkable. "This kid sees things we've only read about," he confided to colleagues after Ibrahim delivered his first presentation on agricultural sustainability. By sophomore year, Ibrahim's grades had risen from the brink of failure to the dean's list. Yet the transformation wasn't only academic. He was quietly developing a leadership philosophy that would later reshape a continent. The late 1960s campus activism exposed him to civil rights movements, anti-war protests, and fiery debates on social justice. He watched American students demand equality while recognizing that his own people faced even greater struggles under colonial and neo-colonial systems. Late-night conversations with African-American classmates revealed striking parallels between their fight for civil rights and Africa's ongoing liberation movements. Inspired, Ibrahim began writing letters to newspapers, connecting the two struggles with sharp, articulate arguments. His professors encouraged him, recognizing a mind capable of bridging theory with lived experience. The once shy village boy was becoming a confident intellectual with a clear understanding of global power dynamics. Graduate studies at Howard University in Washington, D.C. further deepened his insights into international relations and development economics. Living in the U.S. Capitol during the turbulent 1970s gave him a front-row seat to democracy's strengths and failures. An internship at the World Bank revealed the uncomfortable truth of international aid, how it often entrenched dependency instead of fostering genuine growth. His master's thesis on resource extraction and African sovereignty caught the attention of policymakers who had rarely considered these questions from an African perspective. Weekends were spent in Ethiopian and Senegalese restaurants, debating Africa's future with other students from the continent. These conversations planted the seeds of revolutionary ideas about self-determination and economic independence. The young man, once dismissed by test scores, was now formulating theories that would one day challenge global power structures. By 1975, Ibrahim had earned 2 degrees and amassed experience no standardized test could ever measure. His journey from struggling student to respected scholar demonstrated not only personal triumph, but also the failure of rigid assessments to capture true potential. When he returned to Burkina Faso, he carried with him not just diplomas, but a vision of development rooted in African solutions rather than foreign intervention. The villagers who had sacrificed for his education welcomed home a transformed leader, far removed from the uncertain teenager who had left almost a decade earlier. His low SAT scores had become irrelevant footnotes in a story defined by authentic intellectual growth and moral conviction. The true test had never been multiple choice questions. It was whether he could stay true to his values while gaining the knowledge to serve his people. Ibrahim had passed that test with distinction. At precisely 3:09 p.m. Ouagadougou time, the presidential press conference began. Ibrahim Traoré stood behind a simple wooden podium, adorned only with the flag of Burkina Faso. International journalists packed into the modest briefing room, cameras fixed on the yellow document he placed carefully on the lectern. The afternoon heat made the air heavy, but no one stirred as he began to speak in his calm, measured voice. "Today," he said, "I share these scores not out of shame, but out of conviction that true leadership cannot be measured by tests designed to exclude rather than include." His words carried the weight of decades spent, proving that intelligence takes countless forms beyond the confines of standardized assessments. The room fell silent as he continued. These numbers, he said, represented a young man who dared to dream despite every disadvantage. The message was unmistakable. Authentic leadership emerges from struggle, not privilege. Across Africa, television screens lit up with the historic moment as Traoré explained the deeper meaning of his unprecedented transparency. When powerful men mocked education while leaning on inherited privilege, he declared, they revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of human potential. His voice grew stronger with each word. In Accra, Lagos, and Nairobi, university students watched in awe as their continent's youngest president laid bare his academic vulnerabilities to defend the dignity of all struggling learners. The scores themselves quickly became secondary to the courage it took to share them publicly in an age dominated by political image management. Social media erupted with testimonials from professionals worldwide who had once stumbled academically, yet went on to achieve remarkable success. Traoré's openness gave millions permission to acknowledge their own struggles without shame. He had transformed personal failure into collective empowerment. The contrast with Trump's mockery could not have been sharper. Where elitist ridicule rang hollow, Traoré's humility exposed its emptiness. True intelligence adapts to circumstances, learns from failure, and serves others rather than oneself, he explained, his eyes locking onto the cameras. His words carried the authority of a leader who had already reshaped a nation's economy, curbed corruption, and restored dignity to his people. The journalists present understood they were witnessing something far beyond political theater. This was a masterclass in authentic leadership. Diplomats across the globe, watching from their embassies, felt a renewed pride in Africa's emerging voice on the world stage. Traoré's message transcended politics, striking at the heart of assumptions about merit, privilege, and the very purpose of education. The president, who had once struggled with standardized tests, was now teaching the world about the real standards of human worth. As the press conference drew to a close, he offered a final reflection on the relationship between test scores and leadership. "These numbers from 1965 could not predict that I would help transform my nation, nor should they have defined my potential," he stated firmly. His voice carried the wisdom of someone who had learned that education's truest form emerges through service, struggle, and genuine connection to people's needs. What could have been a document of shame had instead become a powerful symbol of hope for anyone ever told they weren't smart enough. International observers realized they had just witnessed a redefinition of political vulnerability, authenticity replacing artifice. The message was revolutionary. The best leaders are often those who understand failure deeply and turn it into compassion for others. Ibrahim Traoré had proven that sometimes the lowest scores produce the highest character. Within hours, social media exploded under the hashtag True Leadership. Twitter alone recorded over 2 million mentions in the first 6 hours, with users from every continent sharing stories of academic struggle and eventual triumph. French President Emmanuel Macron issued a statement praising Traoré's transparency as a lesson in authentic governance that challenged the world to reconsider its definition of merit. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz commended the Burkina leader's courage, noting that real leadership demands the strength to be vulnerable. Even the president of Harvard University released a carefully worded acknowledgement that standardized tests capture only a narrow slice of intelligence and potential. Global news outlets scrambled to find historical precedent for such radical honesty in politics, but few examples came close. The world was witnessing a new form of diplomatic courage, one that upended traditional power dynamics. In the days that followed, American universities reported a surge of applications from African students, inspired by the man whose vulnerability had reshaped the meaning of success. Many cited Traoré's example as inspiration to pursue dreams that once felt impossible. Within 48 hours of his revelation, Prairie View A&M, his alma mater, reported a 400% surge in international inquiries. Dr. Ruth Johnson, the university's president, announced the creation of the Ibrahim Traoré Scholarship, dedicated to students who showed extraordinary potential despite difficult academic beginnings. At Yale, the admissions dean privately admitted that Traoré's story had forced uncomfortable questions about their institution's heavy reliance on test scores over character. Educational testing services soon faced mounting criticism as educators around the world asked whether standardized exams measured leadership potential at all, or simply reinforced inequality. The conversation had shifted. What once centered on mocking credentials now turned to the very purpose of higher education itself. Traoré's openness was compelling American institutions to confront their own biases and limitations. African leaders, meanwhile, found themselves in an unexpected position of moral authority as international media sought their views on authentic leadership. Kenyan President William Ruto praised what he called Traoré's revolutionary honesty that reminds us why Africa leads in human dignity. Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu hailed it as a masterclass in turning vulnerability into strength. At the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, diplomats debated how Traoré's example could reshape relations with former colonial powers. From Cape Town, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa reflected that Ibrahim has shown us that our greatest weakness can become our most powerful truth. For the first time in decades, Africa's leaders were speaking with a newfound confidence, one that did not hinge on Western validation. Traoré had given the continent permission to be unapologetically itself on the world stage. Across the Atlantic, European and American analysts struggled to categorize his unprecedented move. CNN's chief international correspondent described it as either the most brilliant political maneuver of the decade or complete political suicide. The BBC's Africa correspondent remarked that Traoré had redefined what political strength looks like in an age of manufactured personas. Conservative commentators who had prepared to mock the low scores were stunned into silence by the overwhelmingly positive reaction. Liberal pundits praised the transparency, though many struggled to explain why no Western leader had ever shown such courage. The revelation set a new standard for political authenticity, one that few others could hope to meet. Ibrahim Traoré had turned what should have been a weakness into a fortress of moral authority. His modest SAT scores had become the basis for a profound reflection on the link between failure and genuine leadership. Educational psychologists soon began studying his journey, discovering that his early academic struggles had cultivated the empathy and resilience that defined his presidency. At Stanford, Dr. Angela Martinez published early findings, showing that leaders who endured significant setbacks in youth often developed superior emotional intelligence and problem-solving skills. By embracing his failures in public, Traoré demonstrated a rare self-awareness that most politicians spend their lives avoiding. His honesty created space for millions to admit their imperfections without fear or shame. The very scores that could have ended his dream of studying abroad had instead laid the foundation for his greatest strengths as a leader. He had shown that humility, not perfection, is the cornerstone of transformational leadership. In village schools across Burkina Faso, teachers began retelling Traoré's story to inspire struggling students. In one rural classroom, a 10-year-old girl named Fatou, who was failing her French exams, looked up at a poster of her president and whispered softly, "If he can do it, maybe I can." 2. Nurembo's teacher, Amadou Sawado, had watched the press conference with tears in his eyes, finally realizing that his own academic struggles as a young man did not disqualify him from inspiring the next generation. Parent-teacher conferences began to shift, moving away from an obsession with test scores toward deeper conversations about character, perseverance, and resilience. Traoré's example gave educators permission to value what standardized tests could never measure: determination, integrity, and service to others. Village elders joined in, sharing stories of men and women who had never excelled in school but had built lives of immeasurable contribution to their communities. Education itself was being redefined from the ground up. Around the world, leadership development programs scrambled to incorporate Traoré's lessons into their curricula, recognizing that traditional metrics of potential were fundamentally flawed. Harvard Business School announced a new case study titled "Leadership Through Vulnerability, the Traoré Model," exploring how authentic self-disclosure could strengthen rather than weaken authority. Corporate executives began questioning whether their obsession with flawless resumes and prestigious degrees had blinded them to truly transformational leaders. Even the World Economic Forum extended an invitation for Traoré to deliver the keynote at its next annual meeting, acknowledging that his philosophy marked a paradigm shift. Military academies too studied his example, noting that history's greatest generals often rose from humble beginnings. Rather than elite institutions, the president's humility was forcing global institutions to rethink their assumptions about human potential. True leadership, they were learning, required the courage to be genuinely human. Psychologists documented what became known as the Traoré effect, a measurable rise in authentic leadership behaviors among officials willing to acknowledge their own failures publicly. Politicians around the globe began opening up about struggles with addiction, mental health, and academic setbacks, forging unprecedented connections with their citizens. The old strategy of projecting invulnerability was giving way to transparency that voters found far more trustworthy. Traoré's example had created a new template for political authenticity that crossed cultural and national lines. Mental health professionals noted a decrease in shame among clients who had long carried academic or professional failures as private burdens. His vulnerability gave millions permission to reframe their setbacks as stepping stones rather than stumbling blocks. His lesson was simple yet revolutionary. The greatest leaders are those who transform their deepest wounds into sources of wisdom and compassion. 6 months after releasing his SAT scores, Ibrahim Traoré stood before the United Nations General Assembly to deliver what became known as the Authenticity Address. The iconic green marble podium had hosted countless world leaders, but none had ever begun by admitting academic failure as a foundation of strength. Representatives from 193 nations listened in rapt silence as he spoke about the courage required to be genuinely human while holding power. True leadership begins not with perfection, but with the honesty to admit our imperfections and the determination to serve despite them," he declared, his voice carrying across the vast chamber. The words were translated instantly into dozens of languages, but their message needed no translation. It was a call for a new era of authentic governance. Camera flashes lit the hall as he continued. "My 800 SAT score taught me more about leadership than any perfect test ever could." The hall erupted in thunderous applause. The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes, the longest in the history of the United Nations. The address shook the world's assumptions about merit, privilege, and what truly qualifies someone to lead with vision. Traoré's words reached far beyond diplomats and officials. They touched teachers in remote villages, students struggling through university courses, and professionals who had long been told they weren't smart enough to pursue their ambitions. Schools and universities began rethinking admissions, acknowledging that standardized tests often filtered out exactly the kind of resilient, empathetic leaders society most needed. His message sparked a global conversation about the gap between credentials and competence, between privilege inherited and wisdom earned. Social media platforms filled with millions of personal stories about failure, recovery, and eventual growth. For the first time, countless people who had felt diminished by rigid systems of education saw their struggles validated. The president's courage gave rise to a movement that valued human potential over exam scores. In corporate boardrooms and government cabinets, decision-makers began seeking out leaders who had overcome hardship rather than those with flawless academic records. The Traoré principle, the idea that struggle builds stronger leaders than privilege ever could, spread rapidly, adopted by organizations hungry for authentic transformation. Business schools started teaching new courses on vulnerability-based leadership, holding up Burkina Faso's president as a case study in turning weakness into strength. His autobiography, The 800 Score, became an international bestseller, with proceeds funding scholarships for students who, despite struggling academically, showed remarkable character and grit. Universities established second-chance programs for young people whose test scores masked their true potential. A global infrastructure was forming to nurture unconventional excellence, built on the foundation of Traoré's radical transparency. Over time, his modest SAT revelation grew into a philosophy of leadership that placed service above status. His approval rating stayed high, not because he was flawless, but because he was unafraid to admit flaws while remaining fiercely committed to his people's welfare. Around the world, Burkina Faso was increasingly recognized as a model of authentic governance in an era of political showmanship and manufactured personas. His words at the United Nations had become a rallying cry. "Let us measure ourselves not by the tests we passed, but by the lives we've improved. Not by the privileges we inherited, but by the dignity we've restored to the forgotten." A leader once dismissed for barely passing an American standardized test had gone on to redefine the very standards of global leadership. His legacy would echo long after his presidency, urging generations to choose authenticity over artifice, service over self-promotion, and human connection over political calculation. Ibrahim Traoré's courage to share his 800 SAT score proved something timeless. Real leadership is not measured by test results, but by the authenticity to serve others despite imperfections.